Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. When decisions need to be made at any scale, be it in neighbourhoods or nations, it would be reassuring to think that all due care has been given to the problem to be solved and the action to be taken. In the same vein, consideration of problems and potential actions is the backbone of classical philosophy. However, the ever-shifting tides of daily politics can feel a world away from deep philosophical thought. Professor John Martin Gillroy of Lehigh University speaks with us today about how philosophical frameworks can teach us about practical policy. From understanding the axes of personal and cultural motivations, collective or individual actions, and process or principle-led decisions, he considers how today's dilemmas can be approached with a fully considered view of the politics and the people involved. And joining me to talk about their work from Lehigh University is Professor Gillroy. Hello there.
Hello. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you about my work.
Well, if you tell me a little bit of background to yourself and kind of what has led you through the work in a kind of an academic sense, professional sense, and then building up to some of the kind of the body of work that we're talking through today.
I got interested in the philosophical aspects of public policy when I was doing graduate work at the University of Chicago. And in fact, I was in the political science department there. But they just started, when I was there, they just started a master's degree in public policy. And I thought my interest in theory, my interest in public law might be enhanced if I took this MA in policy. And when I looked into it, I thought, well, the philosophy I'd studied had been very difficult and a lot of work. And so I thought, well, policy must be simpler. I looked into it and I found that basically, there was only one methodology, one theoretical approach, and that was basically market analysis or cost benefit analysis. I thought, well, this will be simple, this will be straightforward. But then actually tearing apart cost benefit, I found so many problems and so many questions that I had about what it wasn't taking account of that I decided that the Enlightenment or the philosophy I was studying would give the policymaker so many new tools, so many new sets of assumptions, and also that these guys, mostly men, had basically done all the work. Especially during the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, a philosopher's job was to understand everything comprehensively. So, like in Hobbes' Leviathan, he starts out with some physics about how we perceive things. And then by the time you get to the end of the book, you're in the kingdom of God. So it's completely comprehensive. And I thought, well, these guys have done all this work. They have these logical arguments for practical reason and the requirements of human moral agency. And they're all different. They all have different ones, but there'd be so many more tools for a policymaker to use depending on what they were trying to figure out, what issue and how they wanted to figure it out, what they thought was either wrong with it or what the problems were. So I just launched myself on this adventure trying to figure out, well, first of all, why weren't they using these philosophers? And then as a postdoc, my first postdoc was through the American Philosophical Association, and I was a congressional fellow. And I worked in the U.S. House of Representatives for a member from Massachusetts. So I got firsthand experience looking at these problems and how to do them. And I was doing them trying to integrate the philosophers. But I found out also from the people there who were doing it that the reason they didn't use these philosophers is because they had no idea either they existed, or if they knew they existed, they certainly didn't spend the years that I did trying to delve into them and understand them. So then I started out thinking, well, okay, well, what I've got to do is I've got to take a philosopher like Hume or Kant, and I've got to boil them down into a paradigm structure of essential assumptions. And if I boil them down into this paradigm structure and hand that paradigm structure to a person who's not a philosopher, they should be able to look through it. They should be able to figure out what's going on, understand what the theory of practical reason was, what the requirements for moral agency were, and then that could affect their deliberations. And then when I got my first teaching job, I basically integrated this into most of my classes. In all my classes, I teach argument, which for me is a very formalized format of 6 parts to write a short, concise argument, a political or policy argument. So I generated these paradigms for class. My students generated them. That's been going on now as long as I've been teaching. And then as I went along and I needed areas of expertise, I picked them up. I picked up one in environmental law, I picked up one in constitutional law, and most recently at Cambridge, I picked up an LLM and a PhD in international law. I basically had two big projects. The first big project was a Kantian approach to environmental risk policy. And then this one I'm in the middle of now, I'm looking at the origin, dilemmas, and future of the international legal system through the lenses in order of David Hume, Hegel, and Immanuel Kant. That's where I am. And as a corollary to that, my development of what I call philosophical policy and legal design has gone along. And it's gotten to the point where now I'm thinking of putting together a handbook with my students, with my ex-students. So I'm trying to organize a group of my ex-students to help, because they've been out in the policy realm now for 20 years, doing all kinds of different things. And I was thinking about trying to figure out how to do that.
Philosophical methods and philosophical arguments to many of our listeners might seem kind of abstract, whereas policy does have real-world applications in day-to-day life for everyone, people under the jurisdiction of that policy and internationally as well. So in terms of the practical application of philosophical methods to arguments about humanity, legality, what does that look like in practical terms?
Well, I think you have to start with the assumption that a lot of social scientists and even people in the humanities don't start with, and that is that policy and law is riddled with normative assumptions. The question is, are we going to be honest and uncover what those assumptions are and try to decipher them and understand them? Or are we just going to look at the surface? Just this policy is written this way in the law, that's all we have, and just not take the essential substructure of what we see. I mean, one of the basic premises here is that something that my grandfather told me once, and that is that everything you see is not everything there is. And in policy and law for years now, the surface of the law, the codified law, the surface of policy arguments has been all that people felt was necessary to understand. However, in all of those, there is carried absolute and relative presuppositions about who we are as people, who we're making policy for, what kind of social collective problems or action problems we have, what the role of the state is in any kind of political policy decision. And what I'm trying to do is say, well, look, let's be conscious of that. Let's open it up. Let's say this policy is aimed at a person as a consumer. Is that okay? Is that what we want? It's trying to settle a kind of prisoner's dilemma or an assurance game or a strategic situation that has certain requirements, but let's be honest about what the strategic situation is. And then finally, what role should the state have in this? If it's about the environment and or climate change, it ought to have a role. It ought to have a big role because it needs to coordinate a huge collective action problem, an international, a global one. Whereas maybe some local schools question should be handled much more locally, with much more hands off. Maybe private markets could do something there. But but in order to make those distinctions, in order to make those assessments, we have to understand what the basic normative premises of the argument is. What's its absolute presupposition? What are the fundamental assumptions it makes about us as individuals, as societies, as governments? And so, I mean, my particular tendency is to look at the idea of humanity in the person as the core essential goal or objective of policy ought to have. But that's just one. I mean, I take that from Immanuel Kant. And I think that that's the way that both environmental policy, in my opinion, or in my argument, and the international legal system should be judged on the basis of. But again, it's just taking the normative, well, I call it superstructure, substructure. The superstructure of the law, what you see in the law books, well, that codified law was once policy. It was persuasive policy argument, and that persuasive policy argument was basically normative or a moral argument. So we have to tear away the layers, if you will, like an onion, and try to figure out what's there. And so the practical application, I mean, I think this is the ultimate practical application to really understand what values we're taking into a decision, what values we have had. I mean, every status quo piece of law or policy has a story behind it. And it's uncovering what that story is, which I think is a prerequisite to understanding whether it works or not, why it doesn't work, and then what we need to replace it.
Well, to come back to something that you mentioned in kind of the setup of all of your reading and research, that it is mostly guys that you're referencing here from, well, they're not getting any more recent. So to think of how that fits into a modern world, and sometimes a very different world to what they're exposed to, and certainly increasingly fragmented geographical slices of the West or Europe or the UK or state law even. In terms of philosophical analysis for law and policy, how can there be kind of an approach to relevance in culture and in history?
Well, this, of course, is the topic of the hour. I mean, my approach is that you can emphasize differences or you can emphasize commonality, the universals or particulars, if you will. And it seems to me that all of the questions of culture and identity and all these things come down to our humanity. That's what we share. That's the ultimate universal, if you want. And also, as long as we are trying, and no matter what our cultural differences are, no matter what our identity differences are, at base, my argument is that if we take care of the human factor, if we understand what humanity requires of us in terms of practical reason and our moral agency as human beings, if we understand that, then a lot of the other stuff falls into place. And that is the way I think that you look at fundamental freedom, access to political participation, commonalities across culture, across time, and also my method looks at things as refining themselves over time, so that the requirements of humanity have changed, but again, it's sort of the common denominator. And I think that I'm very influenced by the writings of Immanuel Kant on this issue, who had trouble with his applications because of the era in which he was. But also, I think that what's really important here is to understand what we share as human beings, what that requires of government, of policy, of law. And it's sort of the ultimate fundamental fairness. Now, that doesn't mean that once we've settled that issue, once we've got policy that reflects that, once the policy, for instance, an environmental policy or climate change policy, protects people from disaster and harm, and we may want to discuss particularities. We may want to discuss specifics. We may want to look at this and say, well, there aren't enough women philosophers that we're reading. There aren't enough people of different gender identities. But I think we've tried to do it looking at differences and trying to see. This is another thing I think that what I call positivism, which is the current way that social science is done. It tries to, the application of scientific method, one of its tenets is that you have to definitively classify things. If you can't definitively classify this insect, then it doesn't fit into any pattern. It's no use to you. And I think we've taken that to the human and tried to definitively classify and sort people, which emphasizes differences, emphasizes conflict, and intensifies, I think, this sense of isolation that is permeating all our cultures right now. So I'm just suggesting that maybe we need to approach it from the other end, that we need to look at our common humanity in a non-contextual, not time-sensitive place, and see whether or not we can't get better policy. I mean, in some areas, I don't think we could do any worse, but to see if we can get better policies focusing on what makes us the same rather than what makes us different.
It's a very concise and useful explanation of positivism there. Could we go over maybe some more definitions, kind of state some terms to be a foundation to kind of build up our language and fluency in terms of just like philosophy, law, public policy? What are some essential chapters, categories, indexes? What should people have as a foundation to build on?
Well, I think the fundamental distinction that I try to make is between scientific method and philosophical method. And in philosophical method, I'm talking about one particular philosophical method, which isn't a philosophical method, but from my standpoint, the philosophical method. It's a method that was created by a man named Robin George Collingwood, who was an Oxford professor in the 1930s. And basically, he looked at scientific method, which is the basis for what I call positivism, which is just basically a focus on the surface and sort of the power of states. And he said, well, it's making a mistake here. It's not really talking about humans. It's talking about nature and the causality of nature. And so he came up with 5 differences that philosophical method had to have to understand humanity and to basically make policy for human beings rather than for molecules or other scientific things. And basically, so the first of the 5 is comprehensive philosophy over compartmentalized theory. Again, emphasizing the universal, emphasizing how a philosophical argument tries to integrate the logic of human thought all the way through to how we act and how we ought to act. The second is a dialectic argument over heuristic. An heuristic approach basically says that ideas should be definitively classified, again, the kind of scientific thing, and isolated, both for study and practical application, like physical objects are classified. And any ensuing debate then is based on creating confrontation rather than argument. Confrontational sets of definitive and isolated precepts that will then be pitted against one another in a kind of struggle to the death, which I think is the way our politics looks all over the world right now. We're not arguing dialectically anymore, we're arguing heuristically. And argument's important in both, but differently. For an heuristic debate, one is right or wrong before the discussion even starts. While in dialectic argument, all the positions are assumed to have some fragment of the truth. And the idea is that in argument, in exchange and counter argument, positions will change, ideas will change, and you'll come up with a greater truth. You'll come up with a greater, a more sophisticated result than you would if you just had combat. And because in heuristic argument, you can't cede or change any of your premises because that destroys your argument. And the idea is, and that's what we're seeing a lot of, I think, all over the world in terms of the way in which we are talking to one another or talking past one another. So that's the second one. The third one is where in scientific method, the idea is discovery. In philosophical method, the idea is refinement. And because the idea of freedom, for instance, meant one thing 150 years ago. It means something different now. And it means something more complex now than it did then. I mean, for most of human history, slavery and freedom were considered not contradictory. You could exist in a society, the Greeks existed in a society with both. And it's been part of the human experience for a long time. Now, that's not true. That's not true. We consider them completely contradictory to one another. In the same way, that doesn't mean that people aren't still enslaved in many ways, but it's illegal. Okay, so we've gotten to the point where we've separated those terms, refined freedom to mean, first of all, that people are above price, and second, that you have legal recourse in these situations. So refinement is the main idea. The fourth is overlap of concepts. Collingwood argued that, well, unlike the definitive classification of science, in fact, in human subject matter, all these terms exist. Like, first of all, we know all the terms. We haven't had that many philosophical terms added to our vocabulary in the last 800 years. Again, they've all been refined and mean something different, but they overlap. So you can't talk about freedom without talking about equality. You can't talk about independence without talking about sovereignty and dependence. So it's a matter then of sorting them out and understanding what the relationship is of these concepts. And lastly, that we can't let words like metaphysics intimidate us. Everything, even scientific method, even the scientific theory, has an essential metaphysics of what Collingwood called a single absolute presupposition, and then a set of relative presuppositions that are the means to that absolute presupposition. And this instead of just a dependence on surface validity. Positivism and scientific method are looking for surface validity. They're looking through an experimental inductive system for surface validity. This is more than surface validity. It's trying to, again, to unpack the normative, the substructure, and figure out how it really works. So philosophical method is comprehensive rather than compartmentalized, dialectic rather than heuristic, about refinement instead of discovery, and about overlap of concepts instead of definitive classification, and there's essential metaphysics of absolute and relative presupposition. So each of the philosophical systems or arguments that I look to, I'm looking to apply this to them, those five assumptions, rather than the assumptions of a scientific method.
Which leads to the illustration of your matrix of paradigms, putting kind of one versus the other on a kind of a neat 2x2 grid. I'll see if we can link directly to the illustration for this in the show notes for this episode so people can have it as a visual reference as they listen. But if you could talk me through kind of the labels on those axes along the sides of tops versus left, right, up, down, and some of the applications for when you can address things as here, there, or otherwise.
Well, this is a very preliminary part of my work. It's taken me a long time to put this together. But again, my goal was to give policymakers who weren't philosophers tools to utilize philosophical arguments, different arguments for practical reason and for moral agency. And so the Matrix of Paradigms takes 8 philosophical arguments, that of Rousseau, Hegel, Hobbes, Kant, David Hume, J.S. Mill, John Locke, and then the market paradigm, which is related to Smith, but more than him, especially with modern microeconomics. The idea is that an appropriate paradigm for whatever problem the policymaker is looking for, they can find which one is the best for that particular issue by answering 3 questions. The first question is, do you want the state to be active or passive? That is, do you want the state simply to allow markets or allow private choice to make these decisions, or do you want a more invasive regulatory structure? And and that would depend, I guess, on the issue. Again, I talked about climate change needs a more invasive structure just to coordinate the people, whereas, I don't know, housing or something that's more local may not. So the passive state may be fine for that, especially if you want your law if you want the legal system to maintain stability, to reinforce social conventions, then indeed you're talking about a passive state. So that's first, active or passive. The second one works off my distinction between contextual process conventions and critical principles that are from reason. What we're talking about here is, do you want to emphasize order, function, security, or which is emphasizing process conventions over critical principles, or freedom, liberty, happiness, a critical principle that's verified by reason over those conventions. And then the third question is about whether or not you want to emphasize the collective or the individual. What are you most worried about? If this is a rights question or an identity question, you're more worried about the individual. If it's a social question about environmental harm, then you want to do that. And so by answering those 3 questions, by deciding which side of each of these dialectics you're looking at, you can locate on the matrix the philosopher that I think has the best idea of practical reason and moral agency for you. The problem here, though, is working this out. Again, this is very preliminary. I'm hoping that this will also be refined as it's used more. I mean, I keep going back to it, but if you walk into a library and you put cost-benefit analysis into the search engine, you'll come up with hundreds of books. So the market paradigm has been refined for decades, and it's been worked on by many. This has only been worked on by me and my students over the years. And so the proof will be in the use. The proof will be in how people use it, what problems they find in actually using it. But it's preliminary, but I think it's a step toward a friendlier way or a more accessible way for policymakers and lawyers to look at utilizing a Humean argument for social convention and stability of property, or Rousseau's idea of consent and democracy, or Hegel's idea of freedom through recognition, or Kant's humanity in the person, as absolute presuppositions of policy arguments. Again, just more tools in the tool belt kind of That's a bad idea, I guess, but have more tools in the tool chest. And that's what the matrix is for.
Some of the points that you picked up there of individual rights versus state, I mean, these are things that someone will probably, as fast as I have, pull to mind headlines or news coverage from English, predominantly American news sources, where those aspects have become increasingly politicized and personalized and polarized, where some individual rights or individual groups are being under greater scrutiny, or things that you think where the state should have some intervention. You mentioned environmental policy has drawn a lot of news coverage in the UK recently, where the state has not been as involved as it should by independent monitors and people who think that it should be involved. So to think of legal frameworks and decision making having this philosophical grounding, I mean, what's the influence then of just personal opinion, of pre-existing political belief, skew, bias, any which way, if it's cultural or personally involved or just downright opportunism?
Well, I think we shouldn't mistake what we've degenerated into for how things ought to work and how they used to work in different facets of human endeavor. Also, I think that what's important here is that we're not talking about opinion, we're talking about argument. One of the things philosophical method emphasizes is argument. So it's not polemics and opinion are one thing, and that's what I think we're seeing on the surface of politics. Again, these kind of heuristic arguments, and heuristic arguments have a tendency in politics to degenerate into conspiracy kinds of theories and other kinds of things. So we're talking about argument, and that means, I think, that argument is not polemic. It's not just emotion or passion. In fact, it's the application of reason. It's a well worked out logic of facts and values, and the goal of it is persuasion. Remember that my sort of premise here is that laws codified policy, and policy is persuasive moral argument. So what you have are different moral arguments. But once you take morality and make it an argument rather than an opinion, then you have to subject it to reason. You have to talk about it. I mean, I'm told, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm told that the very conservative Speaker of the House in the United States recently, who has been an opponent of Ukrainian aid, in a series of briefings by security and defense officials here in this country, changed his opinion, or was persuaded by the argument that Putin and the Ukraine were important issues. So much so that he finally got this Ukraine aid package done, I think yesterday or the day before. And so, again, thinking from the standpoint of philosophical method and dialectic argument takes as much of the personal and polemic and impassion based part of this out and replaces it with reasoned argument. I mean, one of the things that I think that the framers of the original government here in the United States look naive now, but they based everything they were doing on the premise that educated people could sit around, could talk reasonably and try to persuade one another about what was important and why it was important, and that it wouldn't degenerate into a kind of mud match, which, again, you're right, is what's happening around. But again, I think making this fundamental distinction is important.
Well, that brings us to something that we mentioned earlier for the kind of current and future debates, dilemmas. Highlighted the Ukraine aid bill that's contemporary as of the time of recording in the middle to late April 2024. Are there any other specific kind of landmark rulings or kind of other applications that you see this bearing? I think of changes in the US legal structure, Supreme Court, or anything that you're keeping an eye on in the UK. If you kind of think fondly of your time in Cambridge and then look at all of the water pollution that we're having to deal with all over the shop.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple I was thinking of. The refinement of the idea of civil rights in the United States, I think, is a very good example. And there were two landmark Supreme Court opinions, one in the late 19th century called Plessy versus Ferguson, and one, of course, the famous one in '54, Brown versus Board of Education. And what you have is a situation where process conventions, the conventions of that set up the apartheid of slavery after the Civil War, after our Civil War, where slavery was constitutionally banned, that was replaced by a set of conventions known as Jim Crow laws, and then the Supreme Court ratified that in Plessy versus Ferguson by saying that separate but equal was a reasonable definition of freedom. What the brilliance of Thurgood Marshall's argument in Brown, which completely reversed that, was basically that through a series of sociological studies and other things, he made an argument basically that separate but equal dehumanized African Americans. And this is a quasi-Kantian argument that diversity is actually a humanity in the person problem, in the sense that human beings can't be truly three-dimensional human beings if they only know people who look and talk and act like them. They have to see the diversity of people and learn from them. I mean, the thing is, what people forget about assimilation is that all the groups that come out of an assimilation exercise have changed. One may appear more dominant, but they've all changed. And so, the Brown versus Board of Education, I would say, is a classical example of how philosophical argument, even though they may not have known it was, significantly changed. I mean, that was a unanimous decision that overturned Plessy 50, 60 years later. And then very, very soon after that, 10 years after that, we had the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, which completely changed the legal structure of our system. Another one that comes to mind is actually an international law case called the Trail Smelter case. This was an altercation between Canada and the United States in the Pacific Northwest. Smelter in Canada was polluting across the Washington border, international border, affecting farmers and citizens of Washington State. This was in the 1940s. There was no international law, basically, in the 1940s that covered this. There certainly wasn't a Clean Air Act. It would now be covered by the Clean Air Act in both jurisdictions. There wasn't anything like that. And so they ended up in arbitration. They ended up with a court case. And in the Trail case, they came up first with compensation, some kind of compensation package, which law courts like. They like that. But then that was seen as not enough. So they created this principle called the good neighborly principle, or the good neighbor principle, which basically then turned into a duty of all countries to prevent transboundary harm. This was ratified both in the Rio Agreement and other things, but also then was applied outside the environment to, for instance, there's a case, actually a British case, Corfu Channel case, where British naval vessels, British merchantmen were basically harmed by mines that had been placed in shipping lanes. And the International Court of Justice said that the duty to prevent transboundary harm was violated in that situation. And that eventually became part of the Articles of State Responsibility, which is customary law now internationally. And then finally, in other court cases, this evolved or refined itself into international environmental impact statements. And lastly, the precautionary principle, which is the way now that we are trying to handle risk internationally. But I think that both Britain and Canada, for instance, how your clean water problems have a lot to do with the fact that government removes itself, because no one person can clean a water system, and it needs to be monitored. Years and years ago in Canada, a conservative government stopped the funding that they gave to municipalities to check their water supplies, and it led to an almost kind of epidemic and deaths. Then took another 20 years to remove the harm. Now the Conservative government in the province of Ontario is thinking about doing that again. And again, but in these cases, in these specific cases, you can see the refinement over time, the idea that it's not just about finances, it's about humanity and what humanity requires and what the freedom of the person means in all these cases. And so in these instances, maybe you don't need as invasive a state or as big as or as active a state for local water supplies, but you need something. You need an international legal structure to handle things like climate change or anything on that level. And again, we've sort of come to terms with that. I think we would have come to terms with that more quickly if we'd, first of all, kept argument in the center of our focus rather than polemic, and also had principles like freedom through recognition or humanity in the person as our core operating principles. But I think you can see them in these cases, even if they weren't explicitly there. You can see them in these cases.
To zoom out a bit and to come back to you after we've talked through the matrix of paradigms and your research and kind of all of the extent of your thought, but to put you back into this conversation, what kind of guiding principles did you personally advocate for yourself and your work, and how they fit into legal and policy analysis?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a number of principles. I'm big on a thing I call philosophical pluralism. And again, a sort of positivist, traditional scientific method approach would argue that you can look at the evolution, the dynamics of something like international law with a single theory. You can have a single theory about it, one principle, one idea, and that'll take you through the whole thing. And I think that doesn't take seriously the idea of evolution, the evolution of the system. Just to look at the international system, it starts out with a series of conventions, a series of practices that turn into conventions that are then formally created into law. But they're process conventions, and they focus on sovereign will, the sovereignty of states. And that's one principle, the idea of stability, what I call justice as sovereignty. However, that doesn't take care of everything. And more now, we're looking at the idea that, well, freedom has to be important. Freedom is important to humanity. And so we need to integrate that. So the next phase, we might want to look at that. I mean, how are human rights and international criminal law and international environmental law and the harm that's trying to assuage, how do you handle that best? And I think that it's, again, I keep focusing on the Kantian idea of humanity in the person as the best way to take what's really important into account, what's really essential. Because if human beings aren't prospering, then policy is basically not doing its job, I think. And so personally, that's where I am. I think that international law and the evolution of what's known as just Kogan's principles or erga omnes obligations that are basically based on authority beyond the state are going to be required to take care of things like a juridical status for people who aren't citizens of any country. I mean, that's a major problem nowadays that states are unable to handle. Human rights. Most people in the world today have rights as citizens of specific countries, but that can't last because if you're a human being, you should, and we're talking about human rights, not citizen rights, then we have to have some way of codifying those. We have to have some way of debating them in policy and coming to terms with some kind of constitutional structure that puts certain of these things as rights aside for everyone and grants people juridical status, whether they're part of a single country or not. I mean, these kinds of questions, I think, are the future questions that humanity in the person as an idea, as a critical principle, verified through reflection, can handle much better than the way we're doing it now, which again it emphasizes differences and not commonalities, and emphasizes the state as the major international player. That's changed over the last since the end of the Second World War. That's changed significantly. But again, I think the trend can be best recognized as a growing awareness of what the demands of humanity in the person are, what it requires of policy and argument, and what it requires of codified law, both in terms of administrative law, common law, but also constitutional law. And the Constitution and the law that goes internationally may not look anything like state constitutions. It may look more like America's Articles of Confederation, which were replaced by our Constitution. But we don't know because we haven't gotten to the point yet of discussing it. And the arguments, I think, have to have some kind of richer philosophical base, even to decide what's reasonable and what's not.
And I think the idea of structures that serve and support a commonality and humanity is certainly something that I can get behind. And if people want to find more about you and your work in this world, where can they find it? I'll do the other question first of, for anyone who is listening to this, What should they be able to take away? And but I always try to frame in terms of public, peer, and policy. If there's anyone listening to this as the layperson on the street, what would you like them to come away from the last hour of conversation having kind of taken on board? Or for people on peer level in academics and research, and for policymakers who this might be part of that effort to inform, educate, and engage in philosophical structures, what can they take from today's discussion?
Well, I think the main thing is that dead philosophers don't mean dead philosophy. These philosophical systems were worked out at a time when, during the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, when human beings were coming to terms with the fact that they were all human beings and that meant different things to different people. But these philosophical arguments, these systematic, integrated philosophical arguments, are worth our attention, and that they are accessible. They are accessible. People shouldn't be intimidated by them. They shouldn't be intimidated by metaphysics, the word, which has made many policymakers' heads explode. But they shouldn't, because what's really important here is to understand that, also to separate a philosopher's argument from the philosopher themselves. The philosopher is a creature like all of us, of context, of time. When Kant was writing about active citizenship and everyone's in inherent right to be an active citizen, he lived in a world where only white males, property owners, were recognized as active citizens. However, his imperative that everyone should have a channel to become an active citizen has incorporated many, many more groups of people since then. But you have to separate the argument, the sort of the argument for humanity in the person, from its applications, its contextual applications. And I think a layperson can take that away. I think that a policymaker can certainly take that away, that it is his pay grade or her pay grade to think about these kinds of things. And I hope that people look past the surface and try to be honest and understand the values, the principles that drive what they're really thinking about, and then to submit those principles to reflective analysis. Don't just assume they're right. A very famous senator once said that that you're allowed your own opinion but not your own facts. Well, I would say that you should be that both the facts of the matter and the values that are being mixed with them, the values that are organizing them and making them real in the world, you need to be unpacked. And we need to make a little effort to do that, because I think most of the major problems that we have now, both in terms of policy and law, have to do with the unwillingness of people to actually look at things dialectically, look at things as each of us has a little piece of the truth. And only by honest, good intentioned argument can we get all the best parts of all these things and put them together to try to really understand what these issues are and how we really want to solve them. I mean, for instance, maybe the way out of climate change is a more diverse set of choices. Maybe we all don't need to drive electric cars. Maybe we shouldn't depend on markets and carbon taxes. Maybe we ought to think more about different tools that we might have, different. And of course, that then brings you to the question, well, what are we trying to achieve? And what's important in the achievement of that? And I think that anyone can think about this and can try to be honest, at least with themselves, if not with anyone else, about whether or not what they're thinking is logical, whether it takes the facts and reasonable values into account, and whether it actually will produce the result that we think is necessary. Well, I have two major books, and I have a book called Justice in Nature that's a Kantian argument for the regulation of environmental risk. It's a bit dated now, but again, the universal argument about humanity I don't think is dated at all. Also, I've written a book on the origins of the international legal system called An Evolutionary Paradigm for International Law that applies David Hume to the origin of the idea of sovereignty. I have an article, a very recent piece, called Ecosystem Policy and Law that's in a Palgrave Reader. And also, I think that, fall out of character here, but I think you guys are putting together a page where I might get some of my PDFs set up, So people might want to look for that.
Yes, we can link to all of those, again, in the show notes that go with these so people can click through to find what they need.
Thank you very much, Will. I appreciate your efforts.
Thank you.